Think for a moment about the most ambitious version of yourself. Not the person you are today, but the person you once imagined becoming. The entrepreneur who would finally build something meaningful. The artist whose work would matter. The leader who would earn respect. The individual who would justify, in some small way, all the hopes they carried for themselves. Most of us spend years pursuing that version. We organize our lives around it. We make sacrifices for it. We endure uncertainty because we believe that somewhere ahead lies a future worthy of our effort. And yet, something strange happens. Again and again, people with extraordinary intelligence fail. People with remarkable talent stall. People who seem destined for greatness somehow find themselves trapped in patterns they cannot escape. The explanation is rarely a lack of ability. More often, it is a failure of perception. They cannot see themselves clearly. Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy begins with an observation that is at once simple and uncomfortable. The greatest obstacle to our ambitions is often not external opposition. It is not the market. It is not our competitors. It is not bad luck. The obstacle is much closer than that. It lives inside the mind. Holiday uses the word ego, not in the casual sense, not merely confidence, not healthy self-respect, not the quiet belief that you are capable of meaningful things. He means something more dangerous, an unhealthy belief in our own importance. The voice that convinces us we already know enough, the voice that tells us we deserve more than we have earned, the voice that quietly whispers that the rules applying to everyone else somehow do not apply to us. The ancient Stoics understood this tendency well. Marcus Aurelius fought against it while ruling an empire. Seneca wrote about it while navigating power and wealth. Epictetus warned repeatedly that the moment we become convinced of our own wisdom is often the moment we stop growing. Thousands of years later, the circumstances have changed, but the problem is not. Technology has changed. Politics has changed. The economy has changed. Human nature has not. Every generation produces people of enormous promise. Some fulfill that promise. Many do not. And when we examine their stories closely, we often discover the same pattern. The downfall rarely begins with weakness. It begins with distortion. A gradual separation from reality. A growing attachment to image. A belief that recognition matters more than mastery. Appearance more than substance. Status more than growth. This is why Holiday's argument feels so relevant. Ego is not merely a character flaw. It is a force that follows us through every stage of life. It appears when we are ambitious and trying to build something. It appears when we achieve success and begin believing our own reputation. And it appears when we fail and can no longer bear the distance between who we are and who we thought we would be. In each case, the consequences are remarkably similar. Ego blinds. Ego distorts. Ego separates us from reality. And once separated from reality, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to grow. What makes this particularly dangerous is that ego rarely feels destructive in the moment. It feels empowering. It feels justified. It often disguises itself as confidence. The ambitious person mistakes ego for self-belief. The successful person mistakes ego for authority. The struggling person mistakes ego for self-protection. And because it wears so many disguises, it often goes unnoticed until the damage has already been done. The central argument of this book can be expressed in a single sentence. Your greatest enemy is not outside you. It is the part of you that refuses to see reality as it is. Today, we are going to walk through the 3 stages Holiday identifies. First, the aspiring phase, where ego prevents us from becoming who we could be. Then success, where ego threatens everything we have built. And finally, failure, where ego turns temporary setbacks into permanent wounds. 3 stages, 3 opportunities for self-deception, and 1 enduring alternative. Let us begin where every ambitious life begins, at the beginning. Part 1. Aspire, the ego that arrives before the achievement. Every meaningful ambition begins as an idea, a possibility, a vision of something that does not yet exist. Perhaps it is a company you want to build, a book you want to write, a skill you want to master, a life you hope to create. Whatever form it takes, the experience is remarkably similar. Before there is evidence, there is imagination. Before there is achievement, there is belief. And before there is mastery, there is desire. There is nothing wrong with this. In fact, it is necessary. No one accomplishes anything significant without first imagining a future different from the present. The problem emerges when imagination begins to substitute for action, when the dream becomes more satisfying than the work required to realize it, when the identity of becoming something starts to feel more rewarding than the process of actually becoming it. Holiday warns that ego tends to arrive very early, long before success, long before expertise, long before wisdom. It arrives when all we possess is potential, and it encourages us to confuse that potential with accomplishment. This confusion is more common than we would like to admit. Many people spend years talking about what they are going to do. They describe their plans in extraordinary detail. They explain their future with conviction. They present themselves as people on the verge of something important. And yet the work itself never quite materializes. Long before expertise, long before wisdom, it arrives when all we possess is potential. And it encourages us to confuse that potential with accomplishment. This confusion is more common than we would like to admit. Many people spend years talking about what they are going to do. They describe their plans in extraordinary detail. They explain their future with conviction. They present themselves as people on the verge of something important. And yet the work itself never quite materializes. The ambition remains largely unchanged year after year. Not because the intention was insincere, but because talking about the future can create the illusion of progress. There is a subtle pleasure in being perceived as ambitious, a satisfaction that comes from describing our plans and receiving encouragement. The recognition feels good. The approval feels good. The identity feels good. Unfortunately, none of those things move the work forward. And so a dangerous exchange takes place. The energy that should have been invested in action becomes invested in image. The person begins performing ambition instead of practicing it. And ego is delighted by this arrangement, because ego has always preferred appearance to reality. Holiday opens this section with a deceptively simple instruction: talk less, do more. At first glance, the advice seems almost too obvious to be useful. Most people would agree with it immediately. Most people would assume they already follow it. Yet if we look honestly at our own lives, we discover how often we do the opposite. A satisfaction that comes from describing our plans and receiving encouragement. The recognition feels good. The approval feels good. The identity feels good. Unfortunately, none of those things move the work forward. And so a dangerous exchange takes place. The energy that should have been invested in action becomes invested in image. The person begins performing ambition instead of practicing it. We announce goals before we achieve them. We discuss projects before we begin them. We seek recognition for intentions that have not yet become reality. And in doing so, we unknowingly weaken our commitment to the very work we claim to value. Behavioral psychologists have observed something curious about the human mind. When we publicly announce a goal, we often experience a premature sense of accomplishment. The brain receives some of the emotional reward normally associated with achieving the goal itself. The recognition arrives early. The satisfaction arrives early. And as a result, the motivation to complete the actual work quietly diminishes. The declaration begins to substitute for the achievement. This helps explain why some people can speak passionately for years about what they intend to become while making surprisingly little progress toward becoming it. The conversations are sincere. The ambitions are real. The enthusiasm is genuine. Yet somehow, the work never accumulates. The dream remains vivid. The results remain distant. Ego thrives in this environment because ego loves the story of success far more than the reality of it. The story is immediate. The reality is slow. The story is exciting. The reality is repetitive. The story earns admiration. The reality often goes unnoticed. And so ego encourages us to remain in the realm of narrative, where we can imagine ourselves as extraordinary without enduring the discomfort required to become extraordinary. The truth is that meaningful achievement rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. Most of the time, it feels ordinary. A writer sits down and works through another page. A musician practices scales that no audience will ever hear. An athlete repeats movements they have already performed thousands of times. Day after day, the work appears almost insignificant. Yet these seemingly insignificant efforts accumulate, and eventually, years later, people call the result remarkable. What they rarely see are the countless hours that preceded it, the invisible repetitions, the uncelebrated discipline, the periods of uncertainty where no external validation existed, the moments when continuing required faith rather than evidence. These are the moments ego struggles to tolerate, because ego wants progress to be visible. It wants effort to be acknowledged. It wants recognition to arrive alongside sacrifice. Reality makes no such promise. This is why silence becomes such a powerful advantage. Not silence as an act of modesty, not silence as a performance of humility. Silence as protection. Protection from distraction. Protection from premature validation. Protection from the temptation to substitute talking for doing. When we remain focused on the work itself, the feedback loop remains honest. The results reveal whether progress is occurring. No story is required. No performance is necessary. Reality becomes the judge. There is another distinction Holiday introduces here that deserves careful attention: the difference between passion and purpose. Modern culture speaks endlessly about passion. We are encouraged to find it, follow it, trust it, build our lives around it. And while passion can be valuable, Holiday suggests it is often misunderstood. Passion is emotional. It burns brightly. It creates excitement. For a time, it can make difficult things feel easy. But passion is also unstable. It rises and falls with mood. It depends heavily on circumstances, and it tends to disappear precisely when challenges become most demanding. Purpose operates differently. Purpose is quieter, less exciting, less dramatic, but far more dependable. Purpose is not primarily concerned with how we feel. It is concerned with what must be done. It does not require constant enthusiasm. It does not require inspiration. It requires commitment. The passionate person asks, "How do I feel about this today?" The purposeful person asks, "What does this situation require of me?" One question is governed by emotion. The other is governed by responsibility. And over the course of a lifetime, responsibility almost always proves stronger. This becomes especially important during the inevitable periods when progress slows, when the novelty disappears, when the work becomes repetitive, when the results arrive more slowly than expected. Passion often struggles to survive these moments. Purpose was built for them. Purpose understands that meaningful achievement is rarely the result of sustained excitement. It is usually the result of sustained discipline, the willingness to continue when excitement has already left, the willingness to remain committed when no one is watching. The people we admire most are often described as passionate, but when we study them closely, we discover something deeper. Beneath the passion was devotion. Beneath the enthusiasm was discipline. And beneath the public success were years of private effort that continued long after the emotional highs had faded. That is not passion, that is purpose. And purpose, unlike passion, is capable of carrying a person across decades. It is also far less attractive to the ego, because purpose is concerned with the work. Ego is concerned with the worker. Purpose asks what needs to be done. Ego asks what recognition will follow. And whenever those two come into conflict, growth depends on which one we choose to serve. Holiday illustrates these ideas through the life of General William Tecumseh Sherman. Today, Sherman occupies a secure place in American history. He is remembered as one of the most effective military strategists of the Civil War and one of the architects of the Union victory. But history has a tendency to compress lives. It remembers the triumph and forgets the years that preceded it. It remembers the reputation and overlooks the preparation. Before Sherman became a celebrated general, he spent years moving through periods of uncertainty, disappointment, and obscurity. He struggled in business. He endured professional setbacks. At various points, his future appeared anything but remarkable. To many observers, he looked like a man who had failed to find his place. Yet beneath the surface, something important was happening. Sherman was learning. He was studying military history, developing a depth of understanding that was largely invisible to everyone around him. And because he was not consumed by the need to appear successful, he was free to become capable. This distinction matters more than it first appears. Many people become so concerned with appearing knowledgeable that they never develop genuine knowledge. They become attached to the image of expertise before earning the reality of it. Sherman avoided this trap. He accepted the role of student long before history would call him a master. When the Civil War eventually arrived, the United States faced a crisis unlike any it had experienced before. The conflict demanded leaders capable of operating under extraordinary pressure. Men who could see beyond immediate appearances. Men who understood not merely tactics, but strategy. Not merely battles, but systems. Not merely moments, but consequences. And suddenly, the years Sherman had spent learning in relative obscurity revealed their value. What appeared to others as delay had actually been preparation. What appeared to be stagnation had actually been development. What looked like failure had often been education in disguise. Sherman was ready not because success had come quickly. He was ready because he had spent years building the capacity that success would eventually require. There is a lesson here that extends far beyond military history. Many people become impatient because they evaluate their lives entirely through visible results. If the promotion has not arrived, they assume no progress is being made. If success remains distant, they conclude that something has gone wrong. But reality is often more complicated. Some forms of growth are invisible while they are happening. Knowledge accumulates quietly. Judgment develops gradually. Competence expands beneath the surface. And for long stretches of time, there may be little external evidence that any of it is occurring. Ego hates this reality. Ego wants immediate proof, immediate validation, immediate recognition. It wants the rewards before the preparation is complete. It wants the reputation before the capability exists. And because of this, ego often abandons the very process that would eventually produce genuine excellence. This brings us to one of the most important ideas in the entire book, the concept of remaining a student. Not as a temporary phase, not as something we eventually outgrow, but as a permanent orientation toward life. Most people understand the value of learning when they are beginners. The beginner expects to make mistakes. The beginner seeks instruction. The beginner accepts correction. There is little threat to the ego because ignorance is already assumed. The danger emerges later, when competence begins to develop, when success begins to arrive, when experience accumulates, when people start treating us as authorities. At that point, learning becomes psychologically difficult. Not because there is less left to learn, but because learning now requires admitting that we do not already know. And ego finds this deeply uncomfortable. Ego wants certainty. Ego wants authority. Ego wants to protect the image of competence. The student, by contrast, is willing to sacrifice the image in order to improve the reality. This is one of the qualities that separates those who achieve success from those who sustain it. The most accomplished people in any field rarely behave as though they have finished learning. The great musician still practices fundamentals. The great athlete still studies technique. The great writer still reads constantly. The great leader still listens carefully. Not because they lack experience, because they understand the limits of experience. They know that yesterday's knowledge is rarely sufficient for tomorrow's challenges. There is a humility embedded within genuine mastery, A recognition that reality is always more complex than our current understanding of it. A recognition that there is always another perspective worth considering, another skill worth developing, another weakness worth addressing, another lesson worth learning. Ego interprets correction as an insult. The student interprets correction as information. Ego hears criticism and immediately begins constructing a defense. The student hears criticism and asks whether there might be something useful hidden inside it. One posture protects identity, the other improves capability. Over time, the difference becomes enormous. The person who believes they already know eventually stops growing. The person who remains a student continues expanding, year after year, decade after decade, long after others have plateaued. The irony is that the people most worthy of being called masters are often the least interested in the title, because they understand something ego never fully accepts. Mastery is not a destination. It is a relationship with learning. And the moment that relationship ends, decline quietly begins. Part 2. Success, the ego that destroys what it helped build. Let us suppose for a moment that you succeeded. The work paid off, the preparation mattered, the opportunities arrived, and the future you once imagined slowly became reality. The company grows, the audience expands, the promotion comes, the book is published, the recognition appears. People begin using words they never used before: talented, gifted, exceptional, promising, successful. For years, these things may have existed only in your imagination. Now, they exist in reality. And naturally, this feels rewarding. It should. Success is not something to be ashamed of. The discipline required to achieve meaningful success is rare, and its rewards are often well-earned. Holiday is not arguing against ambition, nor is he suggesting that achievement itself is dangerous. The danger lies elsewhere. The danger lies in what success can do to our relationship with reality. Failure, for all its pain, possesses a certain honesty. When something does not work, the message is difficult to misunderstand. There is a problem. An adjustment is required. Something must improve. Failure creates pressure to learn, pressure to adapt, pressure to examine assumptions. Success operates differently. Success can create the illusion that learning is no longer necessary. It can convince us that our judgments are inherently correct. It can transform confidence into certainty. And certainty, more than ignorance, is often what prevents growth. This is the paradox at the heart of Holiday's second section. Success is frequently more dangerous than failure, not because success itself is harmful, but because success creates conditions in which ego can flourish unnoticed. The successful person is often surrounded by evidence that their decisions are correct. Their ideas have worked. Their instincts have produced results. And because all of this is true, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish justified confidence from destructive arrogance. The transition rarely happens all at once. Few people wake up one morning and suddenly become consumed by ego. The process is usually gradual. A small reduction in curiosity, a slightly diminished willingness to listen. The changes seem insignificant in isolation, yet over time, they accumulate. And eventually, the person finds themselves inhabiting a reality that has become subtly disconnected from the truth. Holiday illustrates this through the life of Howard Hughes. Few figures in modern history embody both extraordinary achievement and extraordinary decline more clearly than Hughes. He was brilliant, ambitious, innovative, a successful businessman, filmmaker, engineer, and aviator. He possessed intelligence on a scale few people ever achieve, and for a time, his accomplishments appeared limitless. The remarkable thing about Hughes is that his downfall was not caused by a lack of talent. If anything, he had too much talent. Nor was it caused by a lack of opportunity. His opportunities were immense. The tragedy was that his success gradually isolated him from reality. As his power increased, fewer people challenged him. As his wealth increased, fewer people questioned him. As his reputation expanded, fewer people felt comfortable disagreeing with him. The feedback loop that keeps most human beings connected to reality slowly began to deteriorate. This is one of ego's most dangerous effects. It isolates. Not physically, psychologically. The successful person becomes increasingly surrounded by agreement, increasingly protected from contradiction, increasingly separated from honest evaluation. And because this process unfolds gradually, it often goes unnoticed until significant damage has already occurred. The problem is not merely external, it is internal as well. Success can create a subtle shift in identity. The individual begins to confuse what they have accomplished with who they are. Achievement becomes self-worth. Position becomes identity. Reputation becomes reality. This confusion is extraordinarily dangerous because all external things are unstable. Positions change, markets change, public opinion changes, circumstances change. The person who builds their identity upon these things inevitably finds themselves vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The Stoics understood this clearly. They repeatedly warned against attaching the self to external outcomes, not because outcomes are unimportant, but because they are temporary. The only stable foundation for identity is character. Everything else can disappear. Success often encourages us to forget this. The applause grows louder, the rewards become larger, the admiration becomes more visible, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the ego begins whispering a dangerous idea. You were right all along. It sounds harmless, even reasonable. After all, the evidence appears to support it. The results are visible, the accomplishments are real, the recognition exists. Why shouldn't you trust your own judgment? Because reality has not changed. You remain human, capable of error, capable of blind spots, capable of self-deception. Success does not remove these limitations. If anything, it often conceals them. This is why Holiday places such emphasis on humility after achievement. Not performative humility, not the public display of modesty that is itself another form of ego, but genuine humility. The recognition that no amount of success exempts us from learning. The recognition that reality remains more complex than our understanding of it. Unfortunately, this becomes increasingly difficult because success creates a temptation that failure never does. The temptation to believe that the work is finished. The temptation to believe that the person who achieved success is automatically capable of sustaining it. The temptation to believe that yesterday's victories guarantee tomorrow's. History suggests otherwise. Again and again, individuals reach extraordinary heights only to discover that maintaining success requires a different set of virtues than achieving it. Discipline, self-awareness, curiosity, restraint, and perhaps most importantly, the willingness to remain a student even after the world has begun calling you a master. Holiday introduces a concept in this section that deserves more attention than it usually receives. He calls it sobriety. Not sobriety in the literal sense, though the comparison is intentional. He means a kind of psychological steadiness in the presence of success. The ability to experience recognition without becoming intoxicated by it. The ability to accept praise without becoming dependent upon it. The ability to remain grounded while circumstances encourage exactly the opposite. This is more difficult than it sounds. Most people assume that handling success is easy. After all, who would not want more influence, more recognition, more achievement? Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that success places unique pressures on character. Failure forces us to confront our weaknesses. Success often encourages us to ignore them. When things are going well, there is little external incentive to question ourselves. The decisions seem correct. The results provide reassurance. And because success often rewards confidence, it becomes tempting to replace careful judgment with certainty. Holiday offers the example of Katharine Graham. When she became publisher of the Washington Post following the death of her husband, few people viewed her as the obvious choice for the role. She lacked experience running a major media organization. She entered a world populated by executives, politicians, journalists, and business leaders who often knew far more than she did. The situation could easily have provoked one of two responses: paralyzing insecurity or compensatory arrogance. Instead, Graham chose a third path. She remained a student. She listened carefully. She learned relentlessly. She treated every conversation as an opportunity to expand her understanding rather than defend her reputation. And because she was willing to acknowledge what she did not know, she gradually became capable of handling responsibilities that initially seemed beyond her reach. This is one of the recurring paradoxes throughout the book. The people most comfortable admitting their limitations are often the people best positioned to overcome them. The people most determined to conceal their limitations frequently remain trapped by them. Ego sees ignorance as humiliation. Wisdom sees ignorance as a starting point. Over time, Graham transformed herself into one of the most influential publishers in American history. Under her leadership, the Washington Post played a central role in reporting the Watergate scandal and reshaping modern journalism. Her success was not built upon the projection of authority. It was built upon the patient acquisition of it. The contrast with ego could not be clearer. Ego wants to appear knowledgeable. The student wants to become knowledgeable. Ego wants the reputation immediately. The student is willing to earn it slowly. Ego is concerned with how it looks. The student is concerned with what is true. And in the long run, truth tends to be far more valuable than appearance. Holiday argues that this is the real challenge of success, not obtaining it, managing it. Before success arrives, the task is straightforward. Work, learn, improve, persist. The path is difficult, but it is clear. After success arrives, the situation becomes more complicated. Now the challenge is preserving the qualities that made the success possible in the first place. Curiosity must survive achievement. Humility must survive recognition. And self-awareness must survive praise. These transitions sound simple. History suggests otherwise. One of the most common patterns in human achievement is the belief that past success is a permanent credential. A person accomplishes something meaningful. They earn admiration. They gain influence. And gradually, they begin living off the reputation of previous victories. The work that produced the success becomes less important than the identity created by it. We see this everywhere. The executive whose greatest decision occurred 10 years ago. The artist whose best work exists entirely in the past. The athlete who cannot accept that the game has evolved. The leader who continues demanding trust long after they have stopped earning it. In every case, the pattern is similar. The individual becomes attached to who they were, and attachment prevents them from becoming who they need to be. The Stoics had little patience for this kind of thinking. They understood that life unfolds in the present. Reality is concerned with what exists now, not what existed before. Yesterday's success may be worthy of appreciation, but it cannot perform today's work. Yesterday's achievements may deserve respect, but they cannot solve today's problems. This is why Holiday introduces one of the most important Stoic concepts in the book, amor fati, the love of fate. Not merely accepting reality, embracing it, meeting the world as it actually is, rather than demanding that it conform to our preferences. For the successful person, this often means accepting truths that the ego would rather avoid, accepting criticism, accepting change, accepting competition, accepting the possibility that previous methods may no longer be sufficient, accepting that every stage of life requires adaptation. The ego wants certainty. Reality offers complexity. The individual capable of thriving over long periods of time is usually the one who learns to cooperate with these realities rather than resist them. And this brings us to one of the most destructive forms ego eventually assumes. A form so common that many people fail to recognize it at all. Entitlement. The belief that the world owes us something because of what we have already accomplished. This is often where the decline begins. Quietly, almost invisibly. The transition from, "I will earn this," to, "I deserve this." The difference between those two statements appears small. In practice, it changes everything. Part 3. Failure. The ego that turns setbacks into suffering. Everyone fails. Not occasionally, not accidentally, inevitably. Failure is woven into the structure of every ambitious life. The entrepreneur whose business collapses, the athlete whose career declines, the artist whose work is rejected, the leader whose decisions prove wrong, the individual whose plans unfold differently than expected. The question is not whether failure will arrive. The question is what happens when it does. And this is where Holiday makes one of the most important distinctions in the book. Failure and suffering are not identical. Failure is an event. Suffering is often a story that ego begins telling the moment reality refuses to cooperate. Ego does not experience failure as information. It experiences failure as humiliation, a verdict, a judgment upon identity itself. The project failed, therefore I am a failure. The relationship ended, therefore I am unworthy. The opportunity disappeared, therefore my future is ruined. What should have remained a temporary setback becomes a permanent conclusion. And because the conclusion feels personal, learning becomes difficult. The individual becomes preoccupied with protecting their self-image rather than understanding what happened. Holiday illustrates this through the life of Ulysses S. Grant. Today, Grant is remembered as one of the most important figures in American history. But before he achieved military greatness, his life appeared deeply unimpressive. Business ventures failed, professional opportunities disappeared, financial difficulties mounted. His future looked uncertain. At times, it looked hopeless. What makes Grant remarkable is not that he avoided failure. He did not. What makes him remarkable is that he refused to dramatize it. He did not build elaborate narratives explaining why the world had treated him unfairly. He did not spend years protecting his pride. He simply continued. When opportunity eventually arrived, Grant was prepared to meet it because he had not wasted his failures. He had learned from them, and learning requires honesty, something ego rarely tolerates. The ego wants every setback to be someone else's fault. The ego wants every disappointment to preserve the image. The ego wants explanations that protect self-esteem. Unfortunately, explanations that protect the image often prevent growth, because growth begins where self-deception ends. This is why the Stoics placed such importance on perception. Events matter, but interpretation matters too. Two people can endure the same setback and emerge with completely different futures. One becomes bitter, the other becomes wiser. One becomes trapped, the other becomes stronger. The difference is rarely the event itself, it is the story attached to it. Marcus Aurelius practiced something the Stoics called the view from above, a deliberate effort to step outside immediate emotion and observe life from a wider perspective. Not to dismiss pain, not to deny difficulty, but to prevent temporary experiences from becoming permanent identities. This perspective becomes especially important during adversity, because pain naturally narrows attention. It convinces us that the present moment is everything, that the current setback defines the future, that the discomfort will last forever. Experience suggests otherwise. Most of the events that once felt catastrophic eventually become chapters. Many become lessons. Some become turning points. But almost none become the permanent verdicts ego initially claims they are. Holiday introduces another distinction here that deserves careful attention: the difference between dead time and alive time. Dead time is time spent waiting for circumstances to improve, waiting for validation to return, waiting for life to become fair again. It is time consumed by resentment, self-pity, and complaint.
A lifetime is different. A lifetime learns, builds, studies, improves.
A lifetime extracts value from the present moment regardless of external conditions. A lifetime refuses to surrender agency simply because circumstances are imperfect. The example Holiday offers is Malcolm X. Years of imprisonment could have become years of bitterness, years of wasted potential, years of dead time. Instead, Malcolm transformed adversity into education. He read relentlessly, studied constantly, expanded his understanding of the world. And when freedom eventually arrived, he emerged profoundly changed. The prison walls limited his movement. They did not limit his growth. That distinction made all the difference. Failure often presents a similar choice. Will the experience become dead time, or a lifetime? Will adversity become an excuse or an education? The answer determines far more than the adversity itself. Ultimately, Holiday argues that the healthiest people maintain an internal scorecard. They do not rely exclusively on public approval. They do not measure themselves solely through reputation. They do not hand responsibility for self-worth to strangers. Instead, they ask different questions. Did I do the work? Did I act with integrity? Did I respond appropriately to reality? Did I continue learning? When these questions become primary, failure changes. It still hurts, it still matters, but it no longer defines. It becomes information rather than identity, a lesson rather than a sentence, a chapter rather than a conclusion. The alternative: what replaces ego? Throughout this book, a question has remained just beneath the surface. If ego is the enemy, what takes its place? What remains when the obsession with image is removed? When the need for validation fades? When the desire to appear important loses its grip? Holiday's answer is surprisingly simple. Work, craft, purpose, service, reality. Not the performance of work,
The work itself, not the appearance of excellence. Excellence, not identity, contribution. The sculptor focused on the stone. The writer focused on the sentence. The athlete focused on the training. The leader focused on the responsibility. In each case, attention returns to the thing itself rather than the image surrounding it. This shift changes everything. Because the work is honest. The work cannot be flattered. The work cannot be deceived. The work reveals the truth. And when identity becomes rooted in the quality of one's effort rather than the size of one's reputation, something remarkable happens. The individual becomes difficult to destabilize. Success does not intoxicate them. Failure does not destroy them. Because neither success nor failure defines them completely. Their attention remains fixed on what can actually be controlled. Their actions, their choices, their character, their work. The Stoics called this virtue. Not moral superiority, excellence of character. The commitment to becoming the best version of oneself regardless of circumstance. This is the true alternative to ego. Not self-deprecation, not pretending to be smaller than you are, but caring more about truth than image, more about growth than recognition, more about contribution than status. The lifelong practice. Ego is the Enemy is not ultimately a book about success, nor is it a book about failure. It is a book about perception, about the stories we tell ourselves, about the distance between reality and identity. The lesson Holiday offers is ancient. The ego never disappears completely. It returns with every achievement. It returns with every setback. It changes shape, finds new justifications, discovers new disguises. And because of this, managing ego is not a problem we solve once. It is a practice of remaining a student, a practice of remaining humble, a practice of returning again and again to reality. 3 ideas are worth carrying forward. First, while aspiring, choose learning over recognition. Become capable before becoming visible. Second, while succeeding, choose humility over certainty. Protect the qualities that made success possible. Third, while failing, choose growth over self-protection. Extract the lesson and leave the ego behind. And through all 3 stages, return to the work, the quiet work, the difficult work, the unglamorous work, the work that no one sees, but that ultimately determines everything that can be seen. That is the path Holiday points toward. Not a life free from ambition, not a life free from achievement, but a life grounded in reality rather than image. A life where growth matters more than recognition. A life where character matters more than reputation. A life where ego no longer stands between you and what you are capable of becoming. That life remains available. The question is whether we are willing to see ourselves clearly enough to pursue it. If this narration gave you something worth reflecting on,
consider sharing it with someone who may need it. And until next time, stay curious, stay humble, and continue the work.